In the year 865, a massive fleet arrived on the shores of East Anglia. This wasn't a raiding party, this was an invasion force that would permanently alter the genetic makeup of England. The Great Heathen Army, led by Danish warlords, came not just to plunder, but to conquer and settle. And they succeeded in ways that would echo through DNA for over 1,000 years. Today, modern genetic testing reveals something extraordinary. Millions of English people carry Danish Viking ancestry in their genes, concentrated in specific regions that once formed the Danelaw. This is the story of how Danish Vikings didn't just invade England, they became England. The traditional narrative of Viking raids paints a picture of hit-and-run attacks, longships appearing on the horizon, warriors pillaging monasteries, then vanishing back across the North Sea. But the Danish Viking conquest of England was something entirely different. It was systematic, strategic, and permanent. When the Great Heathen Army landed in 865, contemporary sources describe it as the largest Viking force ever assembled. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records their arrival with a sense of dread that permeates the text. This wasn't a seasonal raiding expedition. The Vikings brought horses, supplies, and clear intentions to stay. Within a year, they had conquered the kingdom of East Anglia, killing King Edmund in the process. By 867, they had taken York, the second most important city in England after London. The kingdom of Northumbria fell, then Mercia. One by one, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms crumbled before the Danish onslaught. By 878, only one Anglo-Saxon kingdom remained independent. Wessex, under King Alfred, survived by the narrowest of margins. Alfred's famous victory at the Battle of Edington didn't drive the Vikings out. Instead, it led to a treaty, the Treaty of Wedmore, which formally recognised Danish control over roughly half of England. This territory became known as the Danelaw. The boundary ran roughly from London northwest to Chester, dividing England into two distinct zones. To the north and east, Danish law, Danish customs, and increasingly Danish people. To the south and west, Anglo-Saxon England clinging to independence. But here's what makes the Danelaw fundamentally different from other Viking conquests. The Danes didn't just rule this territory, they settled it en masse. Archaeological evidence reveals the establishment of farms, villages, and trading centres. Place name evidence is overwhelming. Thousands of English locations bear Scandinavian names, particularly in Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, Leicestershire, and East Anglia. Any English place name ending in by means farm or settlement in Old Norse. Grimsby, Whitby, Derby. Names ending in Thorpe mean village. Scunthorpe, Mablethorpe. Names ending in Thwaite mean clearing or meadow. Hundreds of these names cluster in the former Danelaw, creating a linguistic map of Danish settlement. But language and place names can spread through cultural dominance. The truly definitive evidence comes from genetics, and what genetics reveals is remarkable. In 2015, a groundbreaking study published in the journal Nature examined the fine-scale genetic structure of the British population. Researchers analysed DNA from over 2,000 individuals across the UK, comparing their genetic signatures to ancient and modern European populations. The results were striking. The study identified distinct genetic clusters within England itself. People from Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, Norfolk, and the East Midlands showed clear genetic similarity to modern Scandinavian populations, particularly Danes. This wasn't a trace signal, this was a substantial genetic contribution, estimated at 5 to 6% Scandinavian ancestry on average, with some individuals showing much higher percentages. Think about what 6% means in practical terms. If you have 6% Scandinavian ancestry from a population that arrived 1100 years ago, that's not the result of a few isolated unions. That's the genetic signature of mass migration and extensive intermarriage over generations. The Y-chromosome evidence is even more revealing. Y-chromosomes pass directly from father to son, unchanged, except for rare mutations. This makes them perfect markers for tracing paternal lineages through time. Researchers focus on specific haplogroups, genetic signatures that identify distinct ancestral populations. The Scandinavian Y-chromosome marker of primary interest is R1a-Z284. This haplogroup is found at high frequencies in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. but is rare elsewhere in Europe. When researchers mapped R1a-Z284 in England, they found it concentrated precisely in the former Danelaw territories. In Yorkshire, some studies show R1a-Z284 frequencies approaching 10% of the male population. In Norfolk and Lincolnshire, similar patterns emerge, move south and west into regions that remained Anglo-Saxon, and the frequency drops dramatically. The genetic boundary matches the historical boundary of the Danelaw with remarkable precision. But we can go deeper. Within R1a-Z284, there are subclades, genetic branches that separated at different points in time. Some subclades are more common in Denmark, others in Norway, others in Sweden. By examining which specific subclades appear in English populations, researchers can identify not just Scandinavian ancestry generally, but specifically Danish ancestry. And what they find is that the Danelaw regions show a clear Danish signature. The specific genetic variants match modern Danish populations more closely than Norwegian or Swedish populations. This makes perfect historical sense. The Great Heathen Army and subsequent waves of Viking settlers in eastern England were predominantly Danish, not Norwegian. Norwegian Vikings focused their settlements on Scotland, the Scottish Islands, Ireland, and northwest England. Swedish Vikings primarily moved east into what is now Russia. The Danish Vikings conquered and settled the Danelaw. The genetics confirm the historical narrative. Let's consider a specific example. A 2008 study examined Y-chromosome diversity in Yorkshire. Yorkshire was the heartland of the Scandinavian Kingdom of York, the political centre of the Danelaw for much of its existence. Researchers sampled men with Yorkshire ancestry going back multiple generations and compared their Y chromosomes to reference populations across Europe. The results showed that Yorkshire men were genetically intermediate between Anglo-Saxon populations in southern England and Scandinavian populations across the North Sea. Statistical analysis suggested that approximately 40% of Yorkshire Y chromosomes showed Scandinavian affinities. 40%. That's an extraordinary level of genetic contribution. Now, Y chromosome studies measure only paternal lineages and can sometimes overestimate contribution if there's differential reproductive success. But even accounting for that, the signal is unmistakable. Danish Vikings settled in Yorkshire in large numbers, married local women, and their descendants form a substantial portion of the modern Yorkshire population. The same pattern appears in autosomal DNA, which represents contributions from all ancestors, not just the paternal line. Autosomal studies consistently show that people from former Danelaw regions have measurably more Scandinavian ancestry than people from southern and western England. The genetic legacy runs through both male and female lineages. One of the most fascinating aspects is how localised this genetic contribution remains. 1100 years have passed since the Danelaw ended as a political entity. England has experienced internal migration, industrialisation and urbanisation, yet the genetic signature of Danish settlement remains geographically concentrated in the regions where Vikings originally settled. This tells us something important about human population dynamics. Even with significant mobility and mixing, genetic patterns established by large-scale migration events can persist for many centuries. The people of Yorkshire and East Anglia today are, in a very real genetic sense, partly Danish. Modern commercial genetic testing companies have caught on to this. Many now offer specific Scandinavian or Denmark percentages in their ancestry reports. For people of English ancestry, especially from northern and eastern England, it's common to receive results showing 5 to 10% Scandinavian ancestry. That's your Danish Viking inheritance. Some people receive much higher percentages. It's not unusual for someone from Yorkshire or Lincolnshire to test at 15 or 20% Scandinavian. In rare cases, individuals show 30 or even 40% Scandinavian ancestry. These are people whose ancestors extensively intermarried with the Danish settler population. The surname evidence provides another layer of confirmation. Many English surnames have clear Old Norse origins, particularly in the Danelaw regions. Surnames ending in son follow the Norse patronymic pattern: Stevenson, Johnson, Dobson. While son surnames exist in Anglo-Saxon tradition too, their concentration in the Danelaw suggests Norse influence. Other surnames derive directly from Old Norse vocabulary: Thorpe, Croft, Beck, Dale, Fell, Garth. These are landscape terms that became surnames in regions where Old Norse was spoken. The distribution of these surnames maps closely to both the historical Danelaw and the modern genetic evidence of Scandinavian ancestry. Let's talk about what this actually looked like on the ground. When Danish warriors conquered a region, what happened next? The historical sources are frustratingly vague about the social dynamics of settlement, but we can piece together a picture from archaeology, place names, and comparative evidence from other Viking settlements. The Danish settlers were predominantly farmers and craftsmen, not just warriors. They established agricultural communities, cleared land, and built permanent dwellings. Archaeological excavations reveal Scandinavian-style buildings, artefacts, and burial practices appearing suddenly in the archaeological record of eastern England in the late 9th century. These settlers didn't eliminate the existing Anglo-Saxon population. Instead, they integrated with it. Danish men married Anglo-Saxon women. Danish women married Anglo-Saxon men. Children grew up speaking both Old Norse and Old English, languages similar enough that mutual intelligibility was possible with some effort. Over time, a hybrid culture emerged. The legal system in the Danelaw blended Danish and Anglo-Saxon customs. The economy integrated Scandinavian trade networks with existing English commerce. The Danelaw wasn't simply Denmark transplanted to England, it was something new, a fusion culture. But make no mistake, the Danish element was dominant politically and culturally. The Jarls, the Danish earls, ruled. Norse legal terminology entered English law. Scandinavian artistic styles influenced English metalwork and sculpture. And most importantly for our genetic story, Danish families became part of the English population fabric. The Danelaw, as a distinct political entity, lasted roughly 2 centuries. In 954, the last Scandinavian king of York was expelled, and the Danelaw was officially reunited with the English kingdom. But by that point, 200 years of settlement had created a population that was thoroughly intermixed. When we say someone today has 6% Danish Viking ancestry, we're talking about that period from 865 to roughly 1050. That 6% represents approximately 30 to 40 generations of ancestors. To maintain that level of ancestry, there must have been substantial Danish settlement, not just a small ruling elite. Some historians have argued that the Viking contribution to England was primarily cultural and political, with relatively little genetic impact. The DNA evidence definitively refutes this interpretation. The genetic impact was substantial and permanent. Interestingly, the Norman Conquest of 1066 doesn't show the same genetic signature. The Normans ruled England for centuries, but genetic studies show minimal Norman, which is to say French, contribution to the English gene pool. Why? Because the Norman Conquest was a political takeover by a small warrior elite. The Danish conquest of the Danelaw was a genuine mass migration and settlement event. Let's zoom out and consider the broader context of Viking Age migrations. The Viking Age, roughly 793 to 1066, saw Scandinavian populations expand across the North Atlantic and into Eastern Europe. Genetic studies have traced these migrations with increasing precision. Norwegian Vikings settled Iceland, where genetic studies show the population is roughly 60% Norwegian and 40% Celtic, reflecting Norwegian men marrying Irish and Scottish women before or during the settlement of Iceland. The Faroe Islands show similar patterns. Greenland was settled by Norwegians from Iceland, though that colony eventually died out. Swedish Vikings moved east, establishing trade routes through Russia to Byzantium and the Middle East. Genetic studies in Russia show Scandinavian Y-chromosome markers along these trade routes, though the contribution is smaller than in Iceland or the Danelaw. The Swedish Vikings were more focused on trade and tribute extraction than mass settlement. Danish Vikings expanded primarily into England and northern France. In northern France, they established Normandy, the land of the Northmen. The Norman population shows Scandinavian genetic contribution, though it's been diluted by subsequent mixing with the French population. The Normans, who conquered England in 1066, were culturally French, but had Danish Viking ancestors just a few generations back. The Danelaw represents the most successful Danish Viking settlement outside of Scandinavia itself. It was larger in territory and population than any other Danish colony. And unlike Normandy, where the Scandinavian population was absorbed into French culture, the Danelaw maintained its distinct character much longer. This raises an interesting question about identity. Are modern people from Yorkshire or Norfolk partly Danish? Genetically, yes, absolutely. 6% of their DNA comes from Danish Viking settlers. That's more Danish ancestry than many people have from grandparents who immigrated from other countries. But identity is more than genetics. It's culture, language, history, and self-perception. The people of Yorkshire don't speak Danish or follow Danish customs. They're English. Yet they're English people whose ancestors include substantial numbers of Danish Vikings. Both things can be true simultaneously. This connects to broader debates about national identity and immigration. The history of the Danelaw shows that England has always been a place shaped by migration and mixing. The native English population, the Anglo-Saxons, were themselves migrants from northern Germany and Denmark, just 400 years before the Viking Age. Before them were the Romano-British, a mix of Celtic Britons and Roman settlers from across the empire. Every population is a mixture, a product of migrations and mixing events stretching back into prehistory. The Danish contribution to English genetics is just one layer in a complex history of population movements. What makes it particularly visible is its relatively recent timing and the excellent historical documentation that allows us to connect genetic evidence to specific historical events. Modern genetic studies have also revealed something unexpected. Some regions of England that were part of the Danelaw show higher frequencies of certain Scandinavian genetic markers than parts of modern Denmark itself. How is this possible? Denmark's population has continued to mix with neighbouring populations over the past 1,000 years. There have been movements of German speakers into southern Denmark, movements across the Baltic, and general genetic exchange with surrounding regions. Meanwhile, in some rural parts of England that were heavily settled by Danes, populations remained relatively isolated and endogamous for centuries. The result is that specific Scandinavian genetic variants carried by the Danish settlers of the 9th century have been preserved in higher frequencies in parts of England than in modern Denmark. In a very real sense, some English populations are more genetically similar to 9th century Danes than modern Danes are. It's a fascinating population genetic phenomenon. Let's talk about some specific regions within the Danelaw and what the genetic evidence shows for each. Yorkshire is the most heavily studied region, partly because it was the political heartland of the Scandinavian Kingdom of York. Genetic studies consistently show high Scandinavian ancestry in Yorkshire, particularly in rural areas and smaller towns. The frequency of R1a-Z284 in some Yorkshire populations approaches Norwegian levels. Place name density is extremely high, with hundreds of villages bearing Scandinavian names. Interestingly, there's genetic variation within Yorkshire itself. Areas that were more densely settled show higher Scandinavian ancestry. Areas that remained more Anglo-Saxon show lower levels. This fine-scale variation allows researchers to map not just that Vikings settled Yorkshire generally, but specifically where they settled in highest density. Lincolnshire shows similar patterns. The historical sources describe Lincolnshire as heavily settled by Danish armies that were given land there by their leaders. The genetic evidence confirms extensive Danish settlement. The Lincolnshire dialect historically retained more Norse-influenced vocabulary than most English dialects, though much of this has been lost to dialect levelling in recent centuries. East Anglia, particularly Norfolk and Suffolk, was one of the first regions conquered by the Great Heathen Army. It served as a base of operations for much of the Viking conquest. Genetic studies show substantial Scandinavian ancestry in East Anglian populations, though perhaps slightly lower than Yorkshire and Lincolnshire. This might reflect heavier Anglo-Saxon survival in East Anglia, or it might simply reflect sampling variation in the genetic studies. The East Midlands, including Leicestershire, Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire, were part of the 5 boroughs, 5 fortified Danish towns that became important administrative centres: Derby, Leicester, Lincoln, Nottingham and Stamford. These boroughs and their surrounding territories were heavily Scandinavianised. Modern genetic studies show clear Scandinavian contributions in these regions. Cumbria and Lancashire, in northwest England, present a more complex picture. These regions were influenced by both Danish Vikings from the east and Norwegian Vikings from settlements in Ireland and the Isle of Man. Genetic studies show Scandinavian ancestry, but the specific markers suggest a more mixed Scandinavian origin with both Danish and Norwegian contributions. The story of the Danelaw also has implications for how we think about conquest, colonization, and cultural change. The Danish conquest of eastern England was undoubtedly violent in its initial phase. Chronicles describe battles, the killing of kings, and the subjugation of populations. This was not a peaceful migration, but what followed the conquest was not genocide or ethnic cleansing, it was integration. Danish settlers and Anglo-Saxon natives lived alongside each other, traded with each other, and married each other. Within a few generations, the distinction between Danish and Anglo-Saxon was becoming blurred. Children of mixed marriages identified with the hybrid Danelaw culture. This pattern of integration, despite initial violence, is common in pre-modern migrations and conquests. Genetic studies from other regions and time periods show similar patterns. Initial conflict, followed by coexistence, intermarriage, and cultural blending. The alternative, complete replacement of populations, was actually quite rare in pre-modern history. The Norman Conquest provides an interesting contrast. When William the Conqueror seized England in 1066, he imposed a French-speaking Norman elite on an English-speaking population. For several centuries, England had a ruling class that spoke French and a common people that spoke English. Yet genetically, the Norman conquest barely registered. The Normans were too few in number to make a significant genetic impact. The Danish conquest worked differently because it involved mass migration of settlers, not just the imposition of a new ruling class. That's why it left a permanent genetic legacy, while the Norman conquest didn't. Let's consider what this means for modern British identity. Britain has ongoing debates about immigration, national identity, and what it means to be British. The genetic evidence from the Danelaw shows that mixing and migration are not modern phenomena. They're how populations have always worked. The English nation was formed through waves of migration. Celts, Romans, Anglo-Saxons, Danes, Normans. Each wave left its mark culturally, linguistically, and genetically. Modern English people are the sum of all these influences. There's no pure, original English population. There never was. This doesn't mean that national identities are meaningless or that immigration has no cultural effects. It means that national identities are dynamic, constantly being formed at and reformed through historical processes that include migration and mixing. The English identity today is different from the English identity of 1900 or 1800 or 1066 or 865. All of those identities were real and meaningful to the people who held them. The people of the Danelaw gradually came to identify as English, but it was an English identity that incorporated Danish elements. The English language absorbed hundreds of Old Norse words. English legal traditions incorporated Norse concepts. English culture in the north and east had Scandinavian influences that persisted for centuries. The England that emerged from the Viking Age was not the same England that existed before. Genetic studies allow us to see these historical processes with new clarity. We can watch, through DNA, as populations mix and merge. We can see migration routes, settlement patterns, and the demographic impacts of historical events. The Danelaw is one of the best documented examples, where rich historical sources combine with extensive genetic data to tell a complete story. But the Danelaw story also reminds us of the limits of genetic evidence. DNA can tell us about ancestry, but it can't tell us about culture, language, or identity. Someone with 10% Scandinavian ancestry from Danish Viking settlers is genetically part Danish, but culturally fully English. They speak English, not Danish. They follow English customs, not Danish ones. Their identity is English, regardless of their genetic ancestry. Future studies will undoubtedly reveal even more detail about the Danelaw settlement. We may be able to distinguish between early and late Viking Age migrants. We may be able to identify different waves of settlement. We may be able to connect specific modern families to specific regions of Denmark. But the basic story is clear and will not change with future research. Danish Vikings conquered and settled eastern England in large numbers. They married into the local population. Their descendants are still there, 1100 years later, carrying Danish DNA in their cells. Every person of English ancestry from Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, Norfolk, or the other Danelaw regions, is, in a very real genetic sense, part Danish. That 6% Scandinavian ancestry in their DNA testing results isn't noise or error. It's the genetic legacy of the Great Heathen Army and the generations of Danish settlers who followed. The Danelaw was a place where two populations became one, where conquering army became settled community, where initial violence gave way to coexistence and integration. The genetic evidence preserves this process, frozen in the DNA of millions of modern English people. When you see a person from Yorkshire or East Anglia, you're looking at someone whose ancestors include both Anglo-Saxon farmers who'd lived in Britain for 400 years and Danish Vikings who arrived on longships. Both lineages are equally real, equally part of their heritage. The story of the Danelaw is ultimately a story about how populations form and reform through history. It's about migration, mixing, and the creation of new identities from old ones. It's about how violent conquests can lead, over time, to peaceful integration. It's about how DNA preserves historical events long after written records fade. The next time someone from northern England gets their genetic testing results and sees 6% Scandinavian, they should know they're looking at more than just a percentage. They're looking at 1100 years of history. They're looking at the legacy of the Great Heathen Army. They're looking at the genetic signature of the Danelaw, a place where Danish Vikings didn't just conquer, but stayed, settled, and became part of the English population forever. That's the power of genetic evidence. It takes abstract historical events and makes them personal and real. Somewhere in your family tree, if you're from the Danelaw regions, there's a Danish Viking, not just as a colourful story, but as a genetic fact. Their DNA is your DNA. Their legacy lives in you. If you've enjoyed this video, like, comment and subscribe to my channel for more upcoming videos.